Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the UnHerd Club. If this is your first time joining us, then a very special welcome to you. Thank you for braving the rain to be here with us tonight. Tonight we're joined by, I would say, a friend of UnHerd, a writer for The Atlantic, a visiting professor at Bard College, and a former Guggenheim Fellow. He's the author of 2 memoirs, Losing My Cool, which was about his father and hip-hop culture and black masculinity, and more recently, Self-Portrait in Black and White, about the birth of his daughter and how it upended his preconceptions about race. We're obviously going to start there, and then we'll hopefully move through quite a few different topics this evening. We'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take a short break where you can lubricate yourselves in the bar behind you, and then we will come back and you will be very much free to ask any questions you have. So do save those for the second half. Without very further ado, please help me in joining Thomas Chatterton Williams. Welcome him to the UnHerd Club. So I suppose we have to start in the obvious place, and then hopefully we can take some detours into less obvious territory. You once wrote that as a mixed race person, you have an ethical obligation to identify as black. You are one of the very few people, I would say, in a kind of contemporary commentary world who are willing to admit that you've changed your mind. And it's safe to say that you have on that. What is your feeling now about that, and why do you no longer adhere to that kind of idea?
Yeah, this is one of the kind of positions and questions that I've been interested in that I've realized is a lot more complicated and dangerous than I had understood when I started trying to pursue it in an honest way that felt true. It's really a booby-trapped kind of conversation, and I'm glad that I wrote some things about it before I understood how angry people get when you try to just ask why we do things the way we do, and maybe we could do them differently. I grew up, I'm 43 years old. I grew up in the 1980s and 90s in the United States, which is a place that still is very much influenced by the logic and custom of the plantation and of the collision of Europe and Africa and the New World and the slave trade. And it was just a given that if I have a white mother and I have a black father, it's a given that I'm a black boy in American society, and my white friends didn't think I was white, and my black friends were accustomed to accepting people of every single hue and hair texture, because that's what it is to be black in America, is to be, you can appear any way, and it's just accepted that race is binary. And I didn't question it, and I thought, my father is the person that I admire most in this world, and he's been harmed by this thing that we do with race in America, and I want to, my allegiance to him would be to affirm this identity. And then, by the time I was 30 years old, I found myself living in Paris, and I found myself, the vicissitudes of life had me realizing on the cusp of fatherhood that I may very well have a child who I know is descended from my father's people, but maybe the rest of the world won't actually see that when they look at her face. And that's the first time I really confronted, when I explained to people in France, a society that doesn't start from the same premises of the plantation that my society starts from, when I tried to explain to them why that child would still be black, they didn't necessarily just say, oh yeah, of course. And I had to actually hear myself make the arguments for why race is absolute, it's binary, it's binding, and it's something that we should hold on to, even though it's the cause of so much confusion and harm in our society. And I found I couldn't keep repeating that argument.
This is a kind of offshoot of the slave trade logic of the one drop of black blood makes a black person, this kind of lineage of blackness.
And who really found that such an interesting way of seeing the world was Hitler and was the Nazis. And that's the basis, that's the inspiration for the Nuremberg laws, is that you can be a quarter Jewish because there is a potency in blood that contaminates somebody because there's something considered pure. And once I really started hearing myself defend the logic of the one-drop rule, it's not that I stopped thinking, I love my dad's culture that I've inherited. I love the culture I participate in. I didn't stop loving the music or the way that you shake hands, but I stopped believing that this was a biological reality that I should respect and that I should inculcate my children into respecting and upholding.
There is, though, I suppose, a movement in America of parents for whom, even in mixed-race couples, where the importance is put upon identifying as black so that you continue a proud tradition of blackness.
Yeah.
How did your father interact with that? Was he someone who was a proud black man, or was it more complicated than that?
Very proud black man, marched during the 60s and, excuse me, and really understood the position I evolved into because he was the first person I ever heard say, race isn't real, but you will be treated like black in the society because this is the way the society is structured. He's a sociologist by training, but he was never under any illusion that this was something that was anything other than socially constructed and imposed. And so I think there are many ways of participating in cultures and feeling solidarity and kinship with people that don't reproduce a way of thinking that was so appealing to really, like, to Nazis. There's a reason why that kind of structure is so appealing and why they were so inspired by the logic of the American South.
The kind of purity of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. And the idea that it can be quantified and that people can be sorted and that it can even be, there can be a kind of mathematical exactitude to measuring people. So I had my daughter in 2013 and, she did come out, like, my mom's a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white woman, my children's mother is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white woman, and my daughter came out blonde-haired, blue eyes, and very pale skin, and, she's also 23andMe, told me she's 20%, West African descended. So I had to confront this idea of what does it mean that a white person can be significantly descended from Nigerian and Senegambian ancestry, and what does it mean that I can be a black person that can produce a child like this? And maybe these boundaries are kind of porous, arbitrary, and a lot more fluid and unstable than we tend to think. And maybe I just see that because I'm at the edge of it. But maybe these boundaries aren't really as stable as for any of us as we tend to act as though they are.
This argument that your father made to you that race was in fact not real is one that obviously you've taken on and to much controversy.
Yeah, people get really angry when you say that, and a lot of mixed race people. So I also hate the word mixed race because it again implies that some people are pure and some people are impure. But people get really angry about it.
Mm. So tell me what you mean. What does that actually mean in practice? If race is not real, then are we talking just on a biological level, on a social level? You acknowledge there, of course, that there are ways in which people are treated in certain cultures that is racialized. Yeah,
racism is very real, but it doesn't need race to be real to operate. But somebody like Ibram X. Kendi gets really upset, and I asked him about this actually a few years ago when he was really pushing his how to be an anti-racist. He tried to say, it's the white supremacist's dream to have a colorblind society. And I said, well, I actually had interviewed Richard Spencer and some white supremacists, and if we can take people at their word, it was very much not their dream to have a colorblind society. They really wanted a society where people said, no, you're white, you're black, and you stay there, and I stay there. And we all respect diversity insofar as we keep diverse groups of people distinct from each other. Mm-hmm. It's not the white supremacist dream as they articulate their own dreams to have a colorblind society.
What do you mean by a colorblind society? How is that?
A society where I look at you and you look at me, and what's most salient about what separates us is not the physical characteristics that designate you as white and designate me as black or non-white or POC or whatever the term is. That there is something, some other way of interacting and understanding each other and ourselves. Ibram X. Kendi said that that's what the white racist really desires, and it's not. That's what a lot of so-called anti-racists adhere to the idea that color blindness itself is a kind of handmaiden of racism, or it allows racists.
The strange kind of Martin Luther King KKK crossover that we never
very strange,
experienced.
yeah, very strange. But it's kind of really become one of these, it's become common wisdom to say that, of course, colorblindness is in conflict with anti-racism, because anti-racism is supposed to affirm difference. But that's exactly how the horseshoe works, and where the racists and the anti-racists tend to agree is that what matters is this difference, and the only difference that matters is the racial difference, and that's the category that can never be transcended and must be obsessed about and fetishized and enforced.
There seems to be quite a lot of appetite, though, amongst your kind of liberal or progressive colleagues to complicate the idea of sex, another kind of what might be considered by many biologists or sociologists to be a kind of immutable characteristic.
This is dangerous. You're trying to get
very dangerous territory. Would you put race in that same category as something that can be complicated? Because then, of course, you enter into a new dangerous arena, which is the idea of kind of transracialism.
Right. People find that somehow extremely difficult to accept. A lot of people who will maintain that race is socially constructed don't think that you can edit the construct or can choose to augment your race or be transracial. But many of those same people adhere to a prefix menu of progressive views that without question say you can actually edit and change and choose another aspect of identity that one could argue. I'm very scared about this conversation.
Don't be scared here.
You can only have so many hills you're willing to die on, but
yeah, and that's a hill and a half, that one. Okay, so let me just return then, I guess, to the biological argument for race not being real, because this does link up to the idea of sex as a spectrum, or whatever you want to call it, because of course the issue there is that if you have someone going into a doctor's surgery and they have XX chromosomes, then you should be treated differently, in the same way that also if you walk into a doctor's surgery and you are of African descent, you should be tested for sickle cell anemia. Why is it that there is less importance on those kind of biological differences than the kind of what you might call the race realists would want you to think? Why is it that you actually want to break out of that biological
because
framework?
There's no biological difference among groups or between groups that is always holding. So the sickle cell example is really interesting, because that's really about people that grow up around climates where there's malaria. So actually, like, Greeks disproportionately can have sickle cell. So it's not that white people don't really have sickle cell anemia and black people do. It's like people where populations are susceptible to having to defend against malaria develop this thing. And that's kind of been, it overlaps with what we call race, but it is not exact at all. Whenever there's a kind of so-called biological aspect that's supposed to be racial, upon closer inspection, you cannot put your finger on what makes a person black or white or Asian. It always dissolves in your hand when you try to hold it. If there were a rule, I think this conversation could neatly be over, and I'd be willing to accept it if you could just point out the one trait. And maybe you can never, if you're an honest person, you can never say that no one will ever discover something in the genome that won't alter our conversation. But as far as we are now, we have never discovered anything that shows that there's anything other than the human race, and then there's population pools or things like that. There's ethnicities, but sex does seem to me to be something that there actually are some observable realities about. But the kind of progressive orthodoxy flips it on its head, where you're really open to the idea that sex is not at all anything but a construct or a choice, and that race is this kind of straitjacket that we're all locked in and we can never wiggle free. And it seems to me as a very strange inversion.
Well, we have to, I guess, address where this orthodoxy comes from, and much of it stems from that summer of 2020, a kind of moment in American politics with Black Lives Matter, the pandemic, and a kind of election furor all happening at once that felt like a sudden pause in American progress, or at least the story America had about its own political progress. With a bit of distance and time, clarity, time to think, what did that moment do? What's its legacy?
Yes, this is a question that I've been trying to answer, or trying to deal with in my next book, which is coming out in August. What was that? And I delivered the manuscript 16 months late, and I would have had a slightly different answer if I delivered it on time. I thought that 2020 was like a hinge point where there was a before and an after, and nothing was the same. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm getting over a cold. But like with distance, it seems that actually some of it was a moment, a year and a half or 2 years of true collective kind of madness and lack of perspective and excess. But it seems that a lot of the changes were less durable than it had seemed they would be in 2020, 2021. I mean, if someone like Ibram X. Kendi, who I just mentioned, he is no longer even nearly as influential as he was. Robin DiAngelo is not influential. These were people who were being not just cited, but were being, you had to read and buy their books and discuss their books in every major corporation in America and even internationally. I mean, it was such an extreme moment that it seemed like this kind of...
There'd be a paradigm shift.
Yes, and it was less durable, but I think what the real legacy may be, and it's quite disturbing to me, is the reaction, the backlash is all out of proportion and so bad and dark and dangerous. You see it now in the campaign in America. You see the discourse around the other, the discourse around Haitians or immigrants or however you code the other. And that is ascendant in a way that I think was partially empowered by the excesses of 2020 and 2021, but is also something that must be critiqued and rejected on its own terms too. So people who were trying to avoid illiberalism and extremism on the left had quite a ordeal 4 years ago, and during the pandemic and under the last iteration of Trump's America. And people who are trying to reject that illiberalism plus not fall prey to the illiberalism of the right. I mean, it's really it's a tough...
Bad time to be a moderate.
It is. A bad time to be a liberal, bad time to be a heterodox person who rejects ideology and orthodoxy and wants to think about questions honestly. It's tough. You're getting devoured from both sides simultaneously.
It sounds there, though, that you are, in fact, perhaps, which might surprise some people, coming down more heavy-handed on the backlash.
The backlash, I mean, even if something is understandable how it starts, when it attains, I mean, anti-racism and wokeness was understandable how it started. I mean, there actually are real, significant, lasting, entrenched problems in these societies.
I was actually going to pick up on that because I saw a comparison that you made perhaps flippantly to the satanic panic of the 1980s, which I somewhat object to. I think that actually the 2020 moment had far more empirical evidence.
Yeah.
Whether you like it or not, how it was dealt with, it felt that there were very verifiable truths at the heart of why people were acting in a kind of deeply irrational manner. And the problem here is now we're seeing almost the wave has turned and we're getting the opposite, but in a far more potentially extreme and ideological way. Like, I think the online right, as you've mentioned, and you are a particular, I suppose, victim of these kind of
I'm one of the
online
people
right
on
figures.
Twitter who really gets it from both.
You get it, you really do. You really do. I would say you're, if the sign of true heterodoxy is being hated by everyone,
just, like,
then
not
you are
navigating your social media savvy.
Yeah. Maybe time to come off Twitter. But that's the backlash to the backlash to the backlash feels like it's gaining pace rather than losing speed.
Yeah, it's also there's such a lack of willingness to extend anybody grace. There's such a running tab of every mistake the other side made, that it becomes very difficult to disagree in a way that can be productive. I mean, when J.D. Vance got on TV and said, maybe there are no Haitians eating cats, actually, but like I'm trying to create a story here to get people to pay attention to the thing I think is actually important, and it doesn't actually matter. Like if it's not literally true, it's like don't let facts get in the way of the truth. And I think that's very dangerous. And that's like there are a lot of people online that affirm that they know that may be true, that there aren't cats being eaten, but they're riding with him in that unfactual truth, that larger truth that he's speaking to. And I think that that's a very dangerous place you get to, where your opponent can never be right. You can never give an inch. You can never concede anything, because all that matters is the victory for your side. And both sides do that. And I just don't know how you achieve the multi-ethnic society a lot of us pay lip service to wanting to have when you proceed that way.
Mm-hmm. You say there that you see a kind of maybe decline of that 2020, the effect of 2020, but it's very visible in some sectors. Corporate sectors still adhere very much to the kind of principles that were established in 2020 of DEI. It's like a central pillar of many corporate institutions, and has become written into almost law. Mm-hmm. And then academia as well, another area that it feels very entrenched. Do you disagree? Is there actually perhaps a lessening of that?
I think some of that is changing. I think October 7th, and then I actually really think the question of where do Jews fit in society has broken the kind of facile DEI corporate, let's all be good and anti-racist or academic way of seeing identity and diversity. People don't know what to do with Asians and with Jews, but Asians broke like college admissions because POC and minorities, like under white supremacy, they can't compete. So, but wait, why are Asians POC? Because they are dominating test scores, and a lot of them are not even wealthy, and they're really doing better than whites. So how do we factor that in? Let's just not admit them and deal with them. And Jews have a similar question for these kind of oversimplified constructs. It's like, wait, are Jews white? Because they are really being singled out and persecuted in a way that looks like they might be a minority. They're a numerical minority, but we can't actually say that, because Arabs and Muslims have to be POC in the paradigm that we've invented. And so, they can't incorporate it into, like, what does it mean?
Well, it's where the rubber hits the road slightly as well for the theoretical types, because, of course, it requires you to admit that what you wanted was inferiority. And you have to say the quiet part out loud.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have to say a lot of things out loud. And reality is a lot more complicated than that. Yes, a lot of Jews can physically appear white, but yes, they also have histories and ethnic experiences that don't overlap with like the white Anglo-Saxon American kind of position that people have used as like the stand-in for what they mean when they talk about privilege. And you have to actually grapple with two. Jews have succeeded in American society, and they may be being persecuted in certain situations, and they may even also be exercising power. And as the response to October 7th showed, it may be really difficult to figure out who has power in every situation at all times based on their immutable characteristics or their identity, because these things are in flux and they're relational, and you actually have to not have a kind of formulaic way of approaching human diversity. It's actually crazy. And there are black people who are really well-to-do, and they're the children of doctors, and maybe they shouldn't be admitted to Harvard on the basis of race. Maybe we should be looking at people's incomes. And like DEI just gave you a kind of easy way of trying to address these moral questions that people want to feel good about trying to address, but don't want to think that hard about.
I did notice, though, in the wake of October 7th, that suddenly a kind of group of people on the right who had previously considered themselves free speech advocates,
Oh, very much so, yeah.
suddenly decided that actually identity politics, the thing that they had spent so long dismantling, was actually maybe a great idea.
Yeah.
And I was disheartened by that, as someone like you who sits in this uncomfortable valley. How did you feel in those?
Yeah, that was when you really started to see that, because some friends and I, we organized an open letter in 2020, in the summer of 2020, that was
This is
published
the
in
Harper's letter.
Harper's Magazine, yeah, and signed by quite a lot of writers and artists you would know. Maybe most famously J.K. Rowling, which made it a huge thing. But, you know, a lot of people also championed, there were 150 people signed it, but then many people kind of who wanted to critique the excesses of wokeness really latched onto the Harper's letter and said that they cared about the ethos of, you know, resisting censorship and being maximally tolerant. And then a lot of those people, more recently, when their issue became more urgent, quickly jettisoned the kind of principles that were behind a maximally tolerant and non-censorious approach to public debate, and said that actually, there were people saying that people should not just be fired or punished, but they should even be jailed, imprisoned.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, in Texas, you know, the governor of Texas was trying to actually imprison people for protesting, for speech. And there were plenty of people who had said that they cared about the principles of free speech in 2020 who were either silent on that or even saying that he had a point. And so it's dispiriting. There are very few people, there are plenty of people like Sam Harris or my friend and one of the authors of the Harper's letter, George Packer. There are people that are really, Yasha Monk, there are people that are really committed to the principles of liberalism and free expression. And they're a tiny handful of the people that were most animated in the summer of 2020.
Mm. Affirmative action, we should probably talk about just for a moment, because we've covered kind of college politics there. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor made a kind of decision about affirmative action in college admissions a long time ago, but then also said that it should probably be revoked in about 25 years. We are now sitting about 25 years after she made that decision. Do you think that it should end? Is that something you feel is important for the step into this kind of utopian colorblind society that you write about?
I think that we can never fully interact as equals if it's tacitly understood that I can never be expected to enter institutions through the same process that other people are expected to enter into. So I come from a group of people, like many other people come from, who have been historically shut out of opportunity. But and I think it makes sense that to figure out how to redress some of that. And you know, a lot of that overlaps with class inequality. But at some point, you have to get to a point where you say, and if this has been addressed seriously, then we would get to a point where it would no longer need to be addressed, and we would encounter each other as equals. And I don't know what year that is. I don't know if that's 2028, as Sandra Day O'Connor projected, or if it was 2012 or if it's 2050, but it has to happen at some point. Otherwise, we are both agreeing implicitly that I am never going to be equal with you, and we're just doing this kind of pretense that's very, I think it's undignified, and I don't want to participate in that. I don't want that. So I think that affirmative action attached to immutable characteristics is the opposite of what a successful egalitarian multi-ethnic society must be aiming towards. But I would love to see a place, you know, and I speak at these schools and I teach at some of them, like I would love to see some of these schools care more about having poor kids, first generation college students get a chance to study. And they seem less interested in that. I mean, there has been some movement on that, but they seem a lot less interested in that than having maybe even the son of a Nigerian diplomat come to Harvard and they can say that they've let a black kid in. And that is really hard for me to understand, how that is addressing anything like the kind of ethnic and racial harm that was visited upon the descendants of slaves in American society.
Or perhaps it's a clue that that's not actually the goal.
Well, that might be the clue.
You've moved from one republic that says that it's kind of attempted to do this egalitarian project to another, France. You live in Paris. France is obviously kind of famous for trying to strip away everything apart from the identity of being French from its citizens. It doesn't make decisions based on ethnicity. It is attempting a kind of utopian Republican project with this eradication of difference, but it doesn't seem to be working particularly well in terms of how the French people see the way in which they've been treated by the government, at least if you look at the last few rounds of elections and the emboldening of Marine Le Pen, Jordan Bardella, Eric Zemmour over the last few years at the very least. How does it feel to be in France, and do you think that the French experiment is going in the right direction?
I think the French experiment gets something right that America often misses, but America gets things right in practice that France can miss. France gets things very right on paper. And I think like the right way would be some type of middle ground that maybe like a place like London actually achieves. Whenever I take the train from Gare du Nord to St. Pancras, I come off and I'm like, you see all types of people in London, and they have like a lot of swag, a lot of confidence. They seem to be like, you can see just like a Pakistani guy hop out of a Rolls Royce. And that's not every Pakistani guy, but I mean, you have a kind of like vibrancy and dynamism here that like, you go back to Gare du Nord and it's like, it must actually be really difficult to be, I mean, I think there are real issues in France about having recognition in that society if you come from a former colony. I think it's harder to earn recognition there. But on paper, I mean, France actually vocalizes and professes the kind of values that I believe are the right values. That, you know, they struck the race doesn't exist officially in France. You can be whatever you want privately, but in public, everybody's a citizen. And citizenship is paramount, and that's what matters. And then, you know, they don't do all of the kind of weird kind of ethnic fetishization that Americans do. But in my lived reality of 15 years in Paris or whatever, dinner tables are almost all like very progressive, but almost all bourgeois and completely white. But in America, if you're in New York and you have dinner, you would meet a much more diverse cast of characters, even at any class level. And even if you're in Texas, and I give a talk in Texas, and I looked out in the room and I thought, this is incredible, actually. It's like Filipinos, Latinos, white people, black people, and, you know, it wouldn't even be considered an elite space where those people all come at, you know, at a high income level. It was just people's lived reality is interacting with each other more in real life. So I don't know. I think that France has the right ideas, but I think that the kind of hard laïcité, like that hard secularism that they impose, makes people feel unrecognized in a way that has been very harmful. Like, I think that for me, the image of how France fails to achieve a multi-ethnic society is by far the most diverse country on the continent. It has a huge Muslim population compared to Germany or other continental countries, Italy, Spain. But only in France do you have images on the Mediterranean of police officers waking by force a middle-aged Muslim woman up and forcing her to disrobe because she's wearing a burkini. And in France, you must be in a bikini and actually forcing her to take off her clothes on the beach. I think any society that's that dedicated to a kind of secularism is losing the spirit of.
You spoke about dignity before. It's
Yes.
almost secularism at the cost of dignity.
Yes, and I think I admire that France is a secular society and where that comes from in relation to the Catholic Church. But I think you can pursue ends so far that they actually start to exacerbate the problems that they would attempt to address.
One example of that might be the current election cycle that we're in which it does feel that there is a unusually racialized now, given Kamala Harris's taking up the Democrat position, a kind of racialized dynamic, which actually, once you look into it, is not particularly true. I mean, Kamala Harris is, obviously famous in her career for imprisoning young black men, but if you just take the kind of optics, there is a kind of psychic battle that appears to be playing out between a kind of toxic whiteness and a DEI replacement for the sitting president. Is that something you read from your American friends and colleagues? Is there a particularly racialized element to this election, or is that just spin from the New York Post?
Shout out to Ricky Schlatt.
Yeah.
There's a New York Post writer. It's not just spin, but I actually think, many of you, I'm sure, were paying attention in 2008 when Barack Obama was running. I think that there is a kind of racial element to this election, but I think it's actually less than when Obama was running, which seems to me actually, I really do feel like Donald Trump represents something very, very popular and very strong and potent in American society and culture, but I do think it is something that is not necessarily where the society is heading. And when he tried to racialize Harris, and I'm not a huge Kamala Harris fan, but I think she handled the racial conversation very well by just not really leaning into it and just saying, like, it's ridiculous. Like, everybody knows what my background is. Like, next question, please. I'm not going to even like dignify him like splicing whether I'm Indian or black, or it's like that's a crazy even like, why am I like, we're all like less for having this conversation.
She almost seems to be
Obama
embracing like
had
a post-race
Yes, she's like
identity,
actually embodying it in
yeah.
a way that I think is healthy. And a lot of Americans, I think, can move in that direction, and I think some Americans want to pull us back from moving in that direction. But I think it was much more pronounced and difficult, and it was tougher in 2008 and 2012. So I have a kind of cautious optimism there, that even though this is a racialized campaign, it doesn't seem to me nearly where it was. And when you look at the UK, I mean, you didn't have a great prime minister, I think.
Safe to say.
in Rishi Sunak, but what was amazing was that it was kind of also just like, yeah, so he's of South Asian descent, and like, how's he doing the job, and and if he's doing the job well or not is what we're talking about. And it wasn't, I mean, I'm sure there was some racial element to it, but it didn't seem to me like nearly such a big deal, and that seemed quite healthy to me.
Well, also our obsession with leaders is not quite the same. I don't think British leaders quite represent the like id of the American in the way that the American election seems to do. Let's talk about Obama then. What's the legacy of Obama's leadership? Looking back at that, you've got even more distance now. You were canvassing for him, weren't you, when you were
in 2007,
out of college?
2008, yeah. I was really inspired. I mean, my father is 87 years old, and all my life I realized that my father the last person he voted for was JFK. And he really liked JFK, and then he never voted again, and I was like, that's crazy. And he was like, I'll never like believe in a politician like that again. And like, I'll never believe in a politician the way I believed in Obama 2008. It's just, I'll never believe in, like, I just thought that, the election of this man would heal our broken society, and that's obviously too much for anybody's campaign to bear, but Obama really rode in on this moment of, when he won, something like, I have this stat in my book, something like 70% of McCain voters or something said that they were, they wanted McCain to win, but they were really proud of the country and happy that he won, and not bitter about that. And you can't even imagine that now.
No.
It's just impossible.
That's
We're
like-
so split.
Also consensus politics, the idea that you enter into a democratic system and then you accept the result.
Right.
Even that has been somewhat disrupted.
Somewhat is doing a lot of work there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's Obama's legacy? I think it was revealing the potential of American desire to transcend the violations and ugly interactions and relations of the past, but also he excited and awakened a kind of reaction, partially based on how he governed and certain, I think, well-meaning mistakes he made and how he spoke about certain things, like he was elected on the goodwill and hope of the country to transcend race. And unlike what I was just saying with Kamala Harris, like I think there were key moments when he inserted identity, and he can be forgiven for it, but he with Trayvon Martin and with the arrest of a guy I really like and admire, Skip Gates from Harvard, he had a way of speaking about race that was exactly counter to what he was elected to do, which was to prove and embody a post-race America. And so when he played into identity, he was judged in a very terribly harsh way that I think, and some people never wanted to move past race, who also, capitalized on those I think, mistaken conversations. And so his legacy ultimately, unfortunately, I think, is to have made possible. I think there were some Americans that thought, okay, you've elected like a black guy to the presidency. Like, the presidency doesn't matter. Like, we're going to do you one better. We'll elect an absolute charlatan, a carnival barker, and like that's how much this place, is worthy of our reverence now. And
like
I
Trump
think that's
is the
part
court jester put in by.
as part of his legacy is that he made possible Trump, just as part of George Bush's legacy, is that he was such a disastrous president that the country was like, let's give this black guy a shot. Like, people produce the conditions for the reaction. I mean, that's obvious. There's a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. And Obama's legacy is making way for the severe reaction and the kind of the toxic politics that replaced hope. And part of it is not just white people. Part of it is the severe disillusionment that black people and other people of so-called color had when he didn't produce this kind of post-racial era that they had momentarily naively allowed themselves to hope for. He didn't do it. He couldn't do it. And then they also fell into despair that became this decade of anti-racism in quotes and emphasis on identity and no more post-racialism, no more racial transcendence, just Black Lives Matter, and we live in perpetual domination by whites that Ta-Nehisi Coates can say will never be healed until the world succumbs to climate destruction, annihilation, apocalypse. That's the only thing that will stop.
What a
white supremacy.
lovely vision.
But that was what really took hold after this moment where everybody wanted to give this kind of new society a chance, and it didn't happen. So Obama's legacy is that he promised something we all seem to have wanted, or most of us wanted. It didn't happen, and the disillusionment came in from all sides.
You wrote a piece recently about Elon Musk and the way in which he is controlling the public town square, you might say, of Twitter or X.
It's hard to say X.
I hate it. I mean, I'm not going to say it. It's always Twitter to me. So in what way do you think that Twitter is, and Musk particularly as a figure, is degrading this kind of legacy that you talk about there, about the optimism that Obama was offering?
So I used to hate the old Twitter, and I was like, when Elon Musk said he was going to buy it, I didn't particularly, I had no opinion of Elon Musk other than I thought, like, that guy seems to, be innovative in the electric car space. And, PayPal, I use it. Sometimes I have to pay, like, Airbnb, use PayPal. Like, he's done things that are useful. And I thought, like, he can't make this place worse. Like the way that they were doing Twitter was bad. But
Got to be careful what you wish for.
the thing that he did that I think is so poisonous, that still gets short shrift, is when he stripped away, flawed as it was, people having built up credibility and like followings and being verified based on if they were journalists being affiliated with an institution that certainly made mistakes but had institutional credibility, or people being high profile and having a verification on the platform. So you're just saying, I'm stripping all of you and I'm verifying any teenager or idiot or racist who will pay me $8 a month. And then my algorithm will boost their replies to the top and will de-emphasize people who are trying to have honest, serious conversations. That actually was such a destructive and important, like, whimsical decision that he made to the so-called town square where we all get together to discuss the important topics of the day. I don't think it can ever be like overstated that that was the most destructive thing that's ever happened in like the history of social media. It was just terrible. And what it did, whether he wanted to or not, I kind of think based on his own behavior and what he chooses to personally promote to 200 million followers, and through an account that the algorithm also artificially boosts. Elon Musk's tweets and views are artificially pushed into everybody's feed. Wow, I mean, I think that he has allowed people with the most niche and extreme and kind of really like antisocial and actually hateful and disgusting views to really get a hearing, and to actually not just get a hearing, but to actually inform and to shape and mold the conversation. I mean, he can take, the algorithm takes videos of black crime, which is always big on Twitter, and it doesn't matter if it happened yesterday, it happened 5 years ago, it just throws it out there, and it's like, well, let's look at all these like videos of black people like robbing somebody or assaulting somebody, and it just overwhelms the kind of your better instinct to know that like one instance cannot inform your view of an entire population. Mm-hmm. Just as what I spend quite a lot of time in my book talking about how I think we got an extraordinarily distorted view of American society by seeing several or even several dozen instances of black men being shot by police, and then seeing it over and over again on digital loop, and believing that this is actually what happens every day, day in and day out, mm-hmm. to black people in America, when statistically it just does not.
They're also in tandem, we must say, with perhaps going into school or university and being told none of this is happening in a slightly hypnotic way by your tutors or your administrators.
Which one is happening?
That, in fact, none of these kind of conversations are happening, that the only people having these conversations are beyond the pale, and that actually...
That's a good point.
That in combination, I'm saying, that if you're being told in the institutions, your corporate institution, your educational institution, that not only is none of this happening, but if you see it, it's fake.
Right.
And then being able to access at 24 hours a day, 7 days a week...
It happening.
But not just it happening, but a curated feed that makes it look like it's happening more than it actually is. You're getting these two kind of extremes, both of which are false.
Right. And I want to say one more thing, though. Like, you're absolutely right. But there's something else that happens, and it's akin to pornography, because I think what Elon Musk is a purveyor of is actually racism porn. And, they've done studies on this. Every niche sexual interest that exists is available in porn, and it actually doesn't just satisfy a demand, it creates an appetite that wasn't actually there until people were exposed to it.
I've always had this theory that there's teenage boys sitting in their bedroom saying, what would happen if we typed this into Pornhub?
You get it. And
they get it,
exists.
and then they realize, and it's a self-perpetuating loop. No one's actually demanding it.
Right. But then it actually perpetuates, and then some people do get exposed to it and do get attuned to it. And I think that this is what is happening with the racism porn on X, is that you're radicalizing, you're creating the appetite for more racism, and Elon is growing racism in our society, actually. I really do believe that. And, I actually think that free speech is something that we have to be very serious about. You have to be very careful about signing on to any project that would curtail free speech. As Christopher Hitchens said, as soon as you start to, want to limit someone else's speech, you're in potentia creating the rod for your own back. I really believe that. But I also think that, in social media platforms and algorithmic information systems, we have to be able to have honest conversations about what is being dumped into our brains, and the idea that anybody would allow Elon Musk to put a Neuralink in their brain and be in charge of how their mind thinks. This is a crazy world. I'm moving to Tahiti or something. I won't live in that society.
Before we stop for a short break, I just had one last thing, which is you're named, am I right, after the romantic poet Thomas Chatterton, which is, an interesting choice. But
who passed away over in Holborn.
He died not far.
Shoreditch.
Not far from here, of potentially self-poisoning with arsenic, potentially trying to cure his own sexually transmitted diseases.
Exactly. So
he's a strange fellow, and only at the age of 17. What made your parents decide on that name for you, and does he have any kind of role in your life?
Very much so, but it's funny because it's just like one of those things that's he's had an increasing role, just being associated with his name. My father was born in Texas in 1937 under segregation. And, he was a fatherless black boy who felt like he had a lot of talent to share with the world, but didn't always feel like his talents were nurtured, but he tried. And at some point, I don't know when, he came across the story of Thomas Chatterton, who was called the Marvelous Boy, and it was a kind of symbol for he was a proto-romantic poet, but he was a kind of symbol of neglected genius for the Romantics. And my father he was a fatherless boy in Bristol, and my father thought, here was this boy who had so much to offer, and nobody gave him a chance, and he died in poverty. And if I have a son, I would like to name him after him, and so he could do honor to that boy's name. And what I love about that is here's my dad, a black guy in segregated Texas, and here's a poor white boy in Bristol centuries ago. And my dad wasn't who's similar to me based on the epidermis. My dad was this guy's life, it resonates with me because he went through a human experience that I can relate to, regardless of what his physical characteristics are. And for my dad to figure that out in the segregated South, I find that really, it's not just because my dad, it's that's impressive to me that's how his mind was working. And so my dad, I never met somebody who was a writer or anything. I grew up in a neighborhood where nobody becomes a writer, but my dad had a lot of books, and he was you're going to be a writer. And I just wanted to play in the NBA, but at some point, I went to college.
Writer it is.
Going to the NBA. So at some point, he just incepted that in my mind that I wanted to be a writer. And after I wrote something in the New York Times, and I got an email from the Thomas Chatterton Society in Bristol, and they were like, we were Googling Thomas Chatterton for some reason, and we came across you, and whoa, that's a crazy name. And do you want to come and speak in Bristol to the Thomas Chatterton Society? So then they started inviting me out to Bristol. So sometimes I was in a room like this full of people in England who were obsessed with this poet. And one old British woman stood up, and she, after 45 minutes of talking, she was like, I don't understand what's going on. Why are we talking about race? Is your brother named Lord Percy Bysshe Shelley? What is this? And she stormed out. But most people were really interested and wanted to have a conversation just about literary heritage, inspiration, and things like that. And it was really exciting for me to talk to so many people who were interested in this guy. In New Jersey, people just thought I had a weird name, or the weirdest thing is Americans just think everything British is upper class. So people are oh, this Thomas Chatterton Williams is rich. And it's no, I'm named after one of the poorest English guys who ever lived. It's just his name is British. But it was nice to talk to a bunch of people who were interested in him. And, what I never could tell my dad is these scholars were pulling me aside, and they're everybody thinks Thomas Chatterton died because he was poor and heartbroken and killed himself. But he was winning. He was really like, his freelance career was taking off in London, and he had all these girls, and he was trying to treat his syphilis because he was succeeding. And I was like, okay, I can't go back and tell my dad that.
Sorry.
Like,
it was an oversexed teenager.
He was thriving. But for me to tell your dad. I was like, no.
With that, we've got some questions from online, but also I'm hoping we can find some in the room here where we sit. My usual school mom preamble, a question is a sentence that ends in a question mark. We have loads of time this evening to take comments. Comments are reserved for the bar and restaurant downstairs. Questions are in this room only. So please do ask a question, because then we can get through as many as possible in a short amount of time. Julian has a microphone, and he will pass it to you if you've got one. We've got one right in the back there. Let's go for it.
Thank you. What is your view on reparations for past injustices?
Great question.
Great example of a question. That's a gorgeous question.
Just warm you up.
God bless you.
This is an interesting question because I think like one of the things that I wrote that kind of I think resonated with people was in 2015 I wrote a long essay in the London Review of Books criticizing Ta-Nehisi Coates, a writer who I take seriously, but I disagree with a lot of what he was saying, especially like the idea that like white supremacy is implacable and permanent and won't be done until that same rapaciousness ends humanity in a climate apocalypse. I don't like stuff like that. But he had this piece that was when he really leveled up in 2014 called The Case for Reparations, which is the first time I had ever thought seriously about reparations, because it had been a conversation like circulating like niche barbershops in the black community and stuff forever. But Coates started from the premise that was basically like, I'm not talking about like, first of all, I'm not talking about white people paying black people, and I'm not talking about slavery. I'm just like reporting in Chicago with people who are alive right now who were denied FHA loans when the government was helping build like the ethnic white, not the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, but the ethnic white middle class after World War II with like easy mortgages and like a path to middle class home ownership, which is really the way that families secure themselves in American society. The government had a official position that's well documented that was locking a specific group of people, not even like a skin color, but just people from a community that can trace their ancestry back to slavery in America. A specific number of people were locked out of prosperity by design and by practice. And like you could actually make those people whole, and we could even like, you know, people could argue about it intelligently, but we could put a number on it kind of easily. And there are people, Sandy Darity at Duke University, there are scholars who have really studied like what just like redlining or things like that did to black people. And I realized like, damn, my dad is like one of these people who was like denied mortgages in this time period. And like when my dad was pursuing his graduate studies, he's from Texas, and he had to face the draft board. And he was told to his face that essentially, like, in Texas, niggers don't get deferments. So don't know what you're doing here. Don't care if you have a BA, MA, you're pursuing a PhD. That doesn't apply to you. People like that, I think, you know, you could make an argument that they have been harmed by policies of the United States, and the United States should figure out a way to potentially make them whole. I'm open to that. I don't know what that would look like, but that seems to me to be not a completely unreasonable conversation to have. Funnily enough, I remember like a friend of mine, Glenn Lowry, who's like very brilliant black economist who comments on cultural issues a lot at Brown University. We were talking on a podcast, and he was saying he's against reparations, and I was kind of like, okay, but then I went home to my father and I said, you know, can you believe that? And my dad was like, I'm against reparations too. And so I said to myself, you know, I have to have some degree of humility, because for me, I don't think of myself as a person moving through the world as in need of reparations. I certainly think it would be strange for my children to be entitled to reparations. But then when I was talking with their mother, who's a white French woman, she was saying she thinks they should be entitled to reparations because they haven't inherited certain amounts of wealth by design, by policy. So my black dad is against reparations. My children's French white mother is for them, and I'm kind of just open to hearing like intelligent conversation about it. But I don't think it should be ruled out of hat.
We've got the ghostly voice of Siri.
I just don't think I just don't have the ability to say that it's a black and white conversation. Excuse the pun, but like I really think that there are valid arguments on both sides, even the side that's against it by people who have passed through American society during those times when they were directly harmed by policy.
Let's take another question.
Sorry, that was a long answer, but I think it's a serious conversation.
That's good. It's a serious conversation. Let's come down the front. Thanks, Julian.
Going on from reparation, what do you think about apology? Macron's apologized to the Algerians. What do you think?
I don't think that means very much, and I don't need that. I think it's kind of, I don't like being treated. I remember I was living in Berlin in 2017, and I was giving a talk to some German high school students, and at one point, like a girl got up and she was like, well, I think that like, well, we've been taught to basically look at black people like you look at an old lady crossing the street, and it's like, you slow down, you ask her if she needs some help, and maybe she needs some help, and you hold her hand, and you definitely don't like push her aside. And it's like, that's basically like what black people are. And I was like, okay, I don't want to live in a society like that. I don't want your help. I don't want your apology. I just want to have a society where I can compete, where like I'm not restricted from opportunities, and then I can get in the mix, and I can I can be able to exercise my talents and see, what life like can reward me with based on the kind of mix of justice and unfairness that is like the mark of every human life. But I don't need an apology. I just need there to be no active discrimination. And if we're looking for apologies, I want apologies from the Arab world, when they were involved in slave trade and still are. I mean, I want apologies from Ghanaians who are continuously involved in slavery right now. I want every human group can have a list of grievances going back to time immemorial until we get back to Adam and Eve in the garden. Then we need an apology from that serpent. I just want a chance to compete, and that's it. And so I think it's hollow, and I think that based on how the actual government behaves, it's theatrical too, and so I think it's actually harmful.
We'll take a question from online. The subscriber asks, can Thomas please comment on the rise of black Nazis in the United States? I'll give a bit of context to that, otherwise sounds quite strange. There's been a furor recently around North Carolina's Republican candidate for governor, Mark Robinson, who on this is going to sound weirder and weirder as I say it, a kind of a pornography forum referred to himself many years ago as a black Nazi. But you actually did tweet that you thought that there should be some sort of investigation or some sort of, I don't know.
There needs to be
there should be more interest in this post-Obama black Nazism.
Yeah, I didn't read it, but Compact magazine published a piece today on that. But, I was just thinking about how Kanye West came out a couple of years ago praising Hitler, and Candace Owens has been moving in this direction of really caring about Jews in a way that's unseemly. And now you have this guy that like Mark Robinson, who's actually like literally collecting SS paraphernalia. He has a collection of 1/6 life-size SS dolls that he arranges in action poses, and was posting pictures of his Nazi soldier collection.
Men do weird stuff though sometimes.
It's very strange, but. I mean, I think it's also it's tied into this kind of there was an inability to process what it meant that the leader of the Proud Boys was a very dark-skinned so-called Afro-Latino, Enrique, whatever his name was. There is a kind of, I think, understanding outside of America and certain European countries that like. Authoritarianism, the will to domination, really dark and even fascistic kind of tendencies are part of human nature. And I think in the West we have a naive view that thinks that all of these behaviors are distinctly attributable to European civilization, and the truth is maybe far more pessimistic and optimistic. It's just like, no, that's just humans do that to each other.
But
and
also
want to dominate.
the idea that you couldn't be a historical victim and a contemporary aggressor, that those two things could never happen at once.
Well, maybe the optimistic thing to take from that is that you have to think that black people are no longer. I don't think anybody in 1812 could be a black Nazi, but maybe that's a way of saying that, like, how far we've come.
Look where we are.
Yeah.
Isn't it lovely? You can post on a
You're
porn
comfortable enough
forum.
to collect your SS soldiers like everybody else.
Fantastic, Julian.
Thank you for this discussion. I have two connected questions. My first
Is that
one was
Inaya?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Anaya.
I very much agree with you about the rise of the online right and this the way that it's partly a response to identity politics and it's got its own internal dynamics. This kind of fixation on white identity and racial difference and that maybe we're just destined to be kind of separate from one another. But it's very difficult to argue against this, even though you can argue against it obviously from a liberal universalist perspective. But a lot of the racial identity politics that you're talking about is still institutionalized and embraced by liberals and on the left. They're saying that race matters, whiteness is a problem, all of these things, which is feeding into this way of thinking and giving it a new justification. So what do we do about that when institutions are still promoting it? And then the second thing, just very quickly, similarly, I've advocated for freedom of speech for the last few years because it's a core liberal principle as yourself. But I agree with you about the challenge of Twitter at the moment. Because how do we navigate that? Defending freedom of speech, but actually there's a difference where I think the most anti-Semitic, racist, extreme views are essentially being given a megaphone, seemingly by design, on this platform. What do we do about that?
Thanks for both questions. Well, I've been trying, before there was this kind of resurgent backlash, I've been trying, my project for years has been to get people who consider themselves to be liberals or to the left of liberals to disinvest in racial identity. I think, it's a sword anybody can pick up. Before my last book came out, I was speaking about the need to not emphasize, identity, because at some point when everybody is talking, as has been the case in private schools in America, where every group is breaking, racial affinity groups are a thing, and everybody's breaking up, the Asians together, the Latinos together, the blacks together, everybody, what are you proud about your group? The whites are over here, think about your privilege. That'll work for, I don't know how long, but at some point, every school that tried this, the 10-year-olds, the white group becomes a white nationalist, white power, white pride group. And that's inevitable because nobody can perpetually feel like everybody else emphasizes their identity and I must downplay mine. It's a terrible game to be playing. And so, I think all we can do is people who consider ourselves to be liberals and don't want to fetishize identity differences and grievances can just say that we affirm these liberal values of universalism. I think maybe some people might be more open to that, weirdly enough, by they had to see for themselves how ugly it gets when white people at scale start becoming racialized again, because for a long time it was impolite for white people. Whites were neutral, and there's negative aspects of that too, but at least they weren't invested publicly and affirmatively in an idea of whiteness as an identity marker to guard and to promote. And any interest group that's excited along ethnic and identity lines that's already like a majority of the society and has power, I don't see as a minority how you ever want to make that dynamic gain momentum. So I think we just have to keep pushing these arguments for universal principles and ways and criteria that everybody can participate in. I hope that the silver lining to this like re-racialized moment is that more people of goodwill will see the wisdom in that. Your second question was about free speech, and I think that Sam Harris made this point over and over again in the past few years, and I think he's right, and Elon has proved to me that Sam Harris is right. I don't think that England has the same, the UK doesn't have the same free speech protections that we have in America. We're really extreme.
Yeah,
I mean, you can
near,
really get in trouble for saying libel in the UK in a way you cannot in America. And in France, you can go to jail for saying something anti-Semitic. But in America, you really can say anything, and that's important for the government to respect that. But private platforms, I think any community needs to have certain moderating principles. That's just how, otherwise it breaks down. Every comment section that's open to zero moderation, there must be a word for this. It just becomes 4chan at some point. You must have some moderation. And even Elon Musk does moderate. In many markets, he does the bidding of the Chinese government. He does the bidding of Erdogan in Turkey. So he's hardly a free speech absolutist when his bottom line's at stake. But in America, he's willing to allow a kind of laissez-faire attitude that's toxic and actually quite destructive to our politics. So I think that in a private space, it's just common sense that there should be some type of terms of service, which in fact, come to think of it, Twitter does have, X even does have, but it's just that the owner violates them almost every day. So every place does have, every community has principles of moderation, but they need to be enforced fairly.
Let's take...
Hi, I watched today the interview of Harris with Oprah Winfrey, and I don't know your view. I mean, one thing, so Oprah Winfrey introduced all this grassroots movement supporting the campaign, and it was the black women supporting Harris. There were the white dudes supporting Harris. There was the black man supporting Harris. And there were the Southeast Asian. Hopefully, they were not divided between women and men. At least there were one single group supporting Harris. So what's your view on that? And what does it mean for elections and politics?
Yeah, I don't like it. I just don't like it. That's the short answer. I think that the Harris should be a candidate whose policies anybody can buy into. I understand why the first group was just like, I think the first group was black women, and they bundled a ton of money, like in 24 hours for her, and then these other groups caught on. But I think you should talk to the people that that you can influence about who you want to advocate for. That makes sense. And I think there was a specific conversation that actually not even the black women, but black men were having, because Trump was gaining momentum with a kind of non-college educated black male voter, and a lot of like black celebrities and highly successful black men were saying, you need to go into your community, you need to tell these guys who even have a degree of misogyny that you're not lame for supporting Harris, and Trump is not the alpha male that to prove your machismo you have to be behind. Maybe there's a space for that, but I don't like organizing on the basis of identity and ethnic division that way, or gender division. Just I get why it's practically useful, but I don't like it. And I thought Kamala actually did have a good way of interacting with these things. She has not emphasized identity in her own campaign thus far, and I thought it's been savvy and shrewd and also correct. So I would like to get to a future where we just say that, look, the guy she's running against attempted to thwart the peaceful transfer of power. That's disqualifying. I can be green, and I'm voting for the person who is for the peaceful transfer of power, and you don't have to organize on the basis of identity that way. Just principle.
I'm afraid with that we have come to the end of our time in this room at the very least. We will go downstairs and continue the conversation in the bar, I'm sure. But I just wanted to ask one final question so that we end hopefully on the lightest note possible, which is always my aim. As opposed to the kind of Afro-pessimism that abides in institutions and the corporate world, particularly in America, what is the utopian optimism that we should be looking to that will make all of this mess worthwhile?
Yeah. I just want to live in a society, and I do believe we'll get there. A society where, like, I look at you, I see your physical characteristics, and I hear your accent and these things, and none of that can lead me to make judgments on your character or your station in life, and I have to actually speak to you as an individual to understand who you are, because these types of shorthands that we've relied on to slot people into categories of worth or less worth are obsolete. I want to live in a society where those things have been obsolete. I think in places like London and places like New York, in large measure, they have been obsolete. I can't look at you and just see your race or your gender and know what that means about what you do or what you're interested in. And I want more and more of society to reflect that kind of ability for us to be individuals instead of to be avatars of abstract categories that history has put our ancestors into and that we keep reproducing on purpose and also by mistake, I think. And that's a long way of saying I just hope that we can transcend the kind of the prejudices and biases and mistakes of the past and just and meet each other in a more humanistic way.
Thomas Chatterton Williams, thank you so much for tonight.
Thanks. I was trying to talk to you.
That was great. We'll see you all down.